Assalamu alaikum, welcome to beautiful Bali, where I'm here at the ICM conference, and I'm joined this afternoon by Lorna Davies, who is a professor at New Zealand, and we're going to have an important midwifery conversation. Okay, so welcome Lorna, it's lovely to have you. Thank you for taking the time to meet me today. Hope you're enjoying Bali. So can we just begin by giving yourself an introduction, please?
Sure. So my name's Lorna Davies, as you said, Maeve, and I work as an associate professor at Te Pukenga in New Zealand. I live on the South Island, and I work remotely from a wee village up in the hills about an hour and a half north of Christchurch for my work base, which is actually about 6 hours drive away. So
wow,
yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested to hear more about midwifery in New Zealand, and I'd like to hear about your journey in midwifery.
Okay, so I've been a midwife for a long time now, about 32 years, no, a bit longer, 34 years, and in education for 25, 26. You forget, don't you, in a given time, but yeah, a long time anyway. And I taught for 10 years in the UK, and then I had an opportunity to go to Australasia, and I found I call England my homeland and New Zealand my heartland, and I'd always had a pull towards New Zealand. I do have family there, but also in the early 1990s I remember watching with bated breath what was happening with regard to the setting up of continuity of care models there, and the whole idea of being a continuity of carer was something that I really wanted to do. And so when I got the opportunity to go and work as a lecturer there, my family and I packed up everything and moved there over 18 years ago now.
Wow, it's a big move.
It was a huge move, but it was definitely the right thing to do. And it's not necessarily the land of milk and honey. There are problems with the system there, as there are everywhere, but actually it is pretty amazing in terms of the care that women and their families get there. And in terms of education, I think we produce probably some of the most autonomous practitioners in terms of midwifery in the world.
Okay, so I'm really interested in this notion of continuity of midwifery care. For me, I'm passionate about it. I think that all women should have access to continuity of care models. And so I'm interested to hear about how you work, or what kind of model did you work in? Was it a caseload or a team midwifery?
Yeah. No, I mean, I've only ever done it on a very kind of low numbers basis, because I've worked as an educator the whole time I've been there. But until 4 years ago, I did carry a caseload, and I worked in partnership with a colleague. We both had equally small numbers, but basically, when a midwife qualifies in New Zealand, they can set up as what we call a lead maternity care midwife. They're essentially self-employed, although they're actually contracted by the Ministry of Health. But basically, they practice very independently. Women search for a midwife once they become pregnant. We have something called Find Your Midwife, which is a website that women go to find somebody who's in their vicinity. And from that moment on, which may be 4 or 5 weeks, into the pregnancy, up until 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks following the birth, the midwife follows through the woman, and is there for the birth. So it's the whole package. It's not fragmented as in many other places where during birth, labour and birth, somebody else takes on that role. And
so the role of the midwife would be well understood by the general public?
Although there's still, there's still a misconception that, midwives are nurses, even 30 years after the establishment or re-establishment of the profession. Yeah.
You know, like what you said, and I really find this, especially at events like the ICM, that everywhere you work you think that the grass is greener, and that you think that in one country everything is perfect there, and we hear about New Zealand and other countries and we think, oh wow, they have an amazing system, and you absolutely do, every system has its challenges,
and
it
does.
Things that can be improved.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of midwifery, it is strong, right? It is
really
strong.
The midwives in New Zealand are very strong women. They have a strong voice, and yeah, it's a good place to be a midwife for all its problems.
So lots of students and lots of midwives in Ireland and the UK go to New Zealand for experience or want to apply there. Can you talk us through maybe how to apply for midwifery in New Zealand? Is there?
Yeah, well,
is it complicated?
At the moment, there's a shortage of midwives in New Zealand, as there is in so many other countries at the moment. So, yeah, I mean, it is a bit of a dragged out process, but then it needs to be, I think, in some ways, because there is such a degree of autonomy. There's consideration of things like being able to prescribe, which doesn't happen in a lot of countries. Certainly it's not a given at the point of registration. Examination of the newborn, and so there is quite often additional requirements in terms of midwives coming in. Yeah. But it's a matter of getting in contact. That's the other thing. Midwifery Council in New Zealand is our regulatory body. We have our own midwifery council, not part of a nursing. It's Midwifery Council.
I didn't know that actually.
Yeah.
Because I've gone to you for some resources, I think, at times. That's really interesting to hear. So now I'm going to come to the reason why I'm in contact with you, because I know of Lorna Davies through her work on climate change and sustainability. So let's move on to that subject, because I wrote a paper with a team of engineers, environmental engineers, in University College Cork about 2 years ago. About financing or supporting breastfeeding support, advocating for breastfeeding support, rather than funding decarbonisation of formula milk. And it was a really interesting paper, which was really well received. But I needed to look at the evidence, look for any literature around midwifery and climate change, and that's how I discovered the work of Lorna and her colleague Carol Bartle.
Carol Bartle on the breastfeeding front, yeah.
So you've both written on that topic, and I want to know more about your feelings on climate change and midwifery.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that I have kind of had my eye on for a long time now. As a young mother back in the 1980s with 2 tots, I read, actually, didn't hear, a newspaper article by a guy called Jeremy Seabrook, who talked about what lay ahead if we didn't pay heed to our carbon load. And I'd never really considered that before, and he wrote it in such a way. He was talking about the world that we're leaving for our children if we don't take action. And this was back in 1986, and it really resonated. And I saw my 2 kids who were kind of, little tots, toddlers at the time, and thought, this is crazy.
This is important,
Yeah. So I became quite an activist at that time, and became quite politically motivated. And then I ended up going into midwifery, and obviously, you get caught up in something, and having a family and a career, I didn't have the time to pay as much heed, and pulled back a bit politically, but never kind of lost that focus and was very conscious of it. I remember as a student midwife, going back to the breastfeeding point, being absolutely shocked when the course leaders brought in a representative from a formula company to talk to student midwives about breastfeeding. And I was like, well, actually, when you consider what it costs, in monetary terms and environmental terms to produce formula milk, why are we not promoting breast milk?
Obvious,
as a clean, green way of actually providing feed. Not just the health benefits, the actual environmental benefits.
Many benefits. And we have this term now, I'm not sure if you've probably have heard of it, but greenwashing. Have you heard about
absolutely.
Greenwashing?
There's so much greenwashing.
And that's what they're doing with this formula milk. Greenwashing. This is environmentally friendly because we put it through this decarbonisation process. But of course there's nothing.
And we use organic milk, and it's all greenwash, total greenwash. And
and that's the subject of the latest Lancet on breastfeeding. Is about this predatory marketing tactics and any kind of tactics that they will use to market to women and prey on their vulnerability at a vulnerable time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that then, one thing's to, leads to another, as we know, in life. And you know, that I started to focus on sponsorship at that point, and looked at what happened at conferences. And I went to ICM actually in Vancouver in 1992. And the thing that really struck me there was that there wasn't a single formula manufacturer at the conference at all. And I spoke to somebody from UNICEF who was there, and she said, no, we don't have it. It's Canada, we just don't have it. We don't have any advertising. And this is amazing. And in contrast, the RCM were kind of having manicure stalls set up that were sponsored by formula companies. So, you know, I've always been very vitriolic and quite cynical about sponsorship of conferences ever since, and I've spoken about it at length. And I think I boycotted one of our conferences in New Zealand because they had sponsorship from Bayer, and I was very concerned about that as a company, as they were kind of subsidiary company of Monsanto, which isn't a particularly environmentally friendly international company. So so I'd always had that, you know, and I think people thought I was a bit mad because it wasn't particularly trendy back in those days, but it never left me, and I was always really interested. And then in 2008-9, we developed a new program, a new undergraduate program at the institution where I was working in Christchurch at that time. And we were required by the powers that be to provide a course on sustainability. Any new courses that were developed had to have an angle that was sustainability. And I got quite excited and thought, this is an opportunity, you know, that I've been waiting for. So I said, I'll lead that. And I did. And what I found, there were no textbooks, no literature at all pertaining to midwifery and sustainability, environmentalism. And so 3 of us decided to rectify that by editing a book called Sustainability, Midwifery and Birth. And,
which is what I found in 2020 when I was looking for any evidence. It was the only thing I could find.
And it proved to be quite a success because of that, and we did get asked to do a second edition, which for such a niche area I was surprised at, really. And so that was really interesting, and it was great that it was so well received, and it was great to have the opportunity to produce a second edition a couple of years ago. I mean, I was kind of giving my life to it by now, and I was realising, and I'd always said I'd never do a PhD. I'd seen so many friends struggle with it, and I've always primarily seen myself as an educator rather than a researcher. I've always been involved in research, but always felt that my passion lay in learning and teaching, and a bit of a lazy so-and-so as well, I guess. But I decided that nobody else was looking at this area, and so I embarked on my PhD in 2010, and a month before the big Christchurch earthquake, and then followed by subsequent earthquakes. So it was a very kind of turbulent year, and that was interesting in itself. That was another angle on exactly. Well, it wasn't. It's a kind of a forerunner for a lot of the stuff that's now happening in terms of planning. So what I did, I followed 3 group practices of midwives for about 15 months and held focus groups. And it was going to be participatory action research, but it kind of went a bit awry because they really didn't have the time to be co-collaborators in a research then. So it became more of an action research eventually. But what I did get from them was some amazing insight. And what really struck me was that they were really interested in what they could do to be more environmentally sustainable in their practice. And some of the older women, had wonderful memories of using rags, tearing up old sheets and using rags instead of using disposable baby wipes, and lots of things that they did, but they said we just don't have.
To make it trendy again.
I know.
Things trendy. They're coming back in. Things like even the breast pads. You can make them from, I don't know, absorbent material.
Absolutely.
And wash them and reuse
Yeah,
them. Why
yeah,
are we using,
yeah.
you know, disposable things?
And disposable
we
nappies.
just need to be more aware, don't we, about the different
absolutely.
things that we
Yeah.
use, have different approaches,
Yeah.
and going, like you said, going back to the old ways.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
nothing wrong
yeah,
with them.
yeah. And so we had lots of really great conversations, and then it was like, well, you know, how can we take this forward? It was research, it was action research, you know, so how are we going to actually, and I realised that I was kind of hitting a barrier. They didn't want to commit to any more than just talking about it. And so I started to probe a bit deeper, and there were, you know, quite a lot of barriers. And what they were really interested in at the end of the day, or preoccupied by, perhaps I should say, was sustainability of the profession. And they felt that they were so busy kind of keeping themselves safe in the trench that they really didn't have time to think about things like the environmental impacts on the field. And yeah, that was a kind of, so how do you actually get around this? How do you actually get people to engage?
So many things like innovation
Yeah.
and quality
Yeah.
improvement.
Yeah.
How many projects are there out there that are on innovation and the climate and sustainability? I suspect not
Yeah.
very many. And we talk about the Sustainable Development
I
Goals.
know.
We have the SDGs.
Yeah.
We were learning about
But
them
they're
in promotion for
abstract.
students a few weeks ago.
Yeah. People
And
don't
they
relate
don't
to them. You know,
Make them applicable. So how
I
can we do
know.
applied
Yeah.
Sustainability for midwifery. That's a
Exactly.
topic. That's a course.
I
Applied
know.
sustainability for midwifery.
It totally is, and there is one actually where I'm working at post grad level now, that one of my colleagues has developed, and it's
Amazing.
fantastic. But yeah, and so I started to unpack it again, and what I actually found was the effects, and I can't go into too much depth. It became quite political. And basically I looked at the whole kind of ideology of neoliberalism and the impact that that had had on the profession in New Zealand, which is phenomenally interesting. But that was creating huge barriers because, you know, the main tenets of that ideology really is, you know, choice, risk, blame, and fear. And so it was almost like we had dug ourselves into a trench and we were almost too scared to come out. And so, you know, everybody was the enemy, and, you know, doctors were the enemy and nursing was the enemy. And then you start looking back historically, and, you know, we've always fought for our corner, and that's what we were doing. We were still doing that to the exclusion of trying to think about how we're going to manage this big thing that's coming, that we may have to be first responders for climate emergencies. We're not really looking at that. We're looking at, you know, how can we mitigate risks? And yeah, so that's where I ended up. It wasn't a very conclusive answer, you know, ending to it, but yeah, and I think we've got a long way to go. But there's so much we can do, you know. And what does give me hope is the course that I developed for our third-year students on the undergraduate programme. Asked them to work as a group and to develop a sustainable midwifery practice, and that included everything from the build. They could, because they work in group practices, we could say, you know, you're actually doing this from scratch. You know, who are you going to employ? How are you going to do it? And they did the most amazing projects, and they'd do things like they'd think about solar gain. They'd have vegetable gardens. They were going to do sort of cookery tutorials with the women in their caseload, so they could learn how to use fresh vegetables to create beautiful meals. And, you know, and really were thinking about it very holistically. You know, they had, like going back to what we were saying, reusable breast pads and reusable nappies. They were not going to be using disposable instruments. They were going to go back to autoclaving, buying beautiful, solid stainless steel faucets and scissors and cord clamps. They could, not cord clamps. Cord clamps were interesting. There's the flax, a lot of flax in New Zealand, harakiki, and so they make these beautiful little ties because they have antiseptic properties. Amazing. And midwives are actually doing this now quite a lot. Yeah, so they'd sterilise
in
them.
different cultural things about birth, and I want to talk to you about that too.
I know,
we don't really have time to go into so many
I know.
different cultural things.
But you know, once you actually gave them the license to do that, they came up with the most wonderful ideas about how they would achieve that. So that really gives me hope and sustains me probably more than my PhD did in some ways. But yeah, we've got a long way to go, and there are so many areas. Transport, you know, how can you minimise the use of transport? We talked about living in the community where you were working, so you didn't have to travel so far, and you know, we had lots of discussion and debate around that one. You know, some pros and some cons, but we've got midwives who are using bikes around the city in Christchurch, not necessarily for labour and birth, but for antenatal, postnatal. Midwife being a social connector who brings people together. A lot of discussion around that, either in groups or refugees, putting refugee women in touch with each other. So, you know, the three tenets of sustainability are social, environmental, and economic. And you have to kind of bring those three things together. And when you look at what they were doing in terms of that assignment, it was quite remarkable. So I do have hope, and I think, you know, we are all going to have to get on board with it eventually, and that there are more sustainability courses within midwifery curricula around the world.
So thank you so much. It's absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed this conversation, but unfortunately we're going to come to the end of the interview now. So I want to just finish by asking you how you found the conference over the last couple of days, and if you've been to any inspirational presentations, and what are your take-home messages or messages of hope, I guess, for anyone who's been following these conversations, any student midwives, future midwives, and midwives around the world at the moment. What's your message?
Well, as I said earlier, my very first ICM was in Vancouver in 1991 or two, must have been two, and I've been reflecting and back and thinking how much things have changed. And the biggest change, I think, is that we've moved away from practice-based issues in terms of presentations to much more conceptual. We're looking at much bigger picture stuff now. There's a lot around conflict, a lot around decolonization. You know, it feels like we've moved on in a global sense. And for me, there's a much stronger feeling of globalization and global issues at this particular conference than I've ever considered before. So I think that's reflective of how we're moving on, perhaps as a world and certainly as a profession as well. Interestingly, there isn't a lot on climate change here, and I think that's an omission. For me, it's the elephant in the room, and so much else actually, you know, links to that whole issue, and we're not actually looking at that. We're looking at some of the kind of spin-offs from climate change without actually addressing the problems. So certainly for the next ICM, it would be amazing to see a real focus on climate change and sustainability.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks for taking the time to speak to me. I hope you enjoy the next few days and the rest of the ICM conference.
No, thank you for asking me, Maeve.
Bye.